Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan, also known as the Medieval Genie, and today we'll be talking about what this replica is representing, which is the historical sword of a United States 1860 pattern light cavalry sabre. And I will be going over the various details over the real sword, of course in contrast with this replica, which is a reasonable analogue we'll use for now. And we'll talk about why each of these details can actually be quite important. You might just look at these things, you might see, oh, you know, there's a little different shape and size and a kind of cosmetic, you know, this sword looks cool and this one. And of course, you'll sometimes see things which, you know, are decorative, fancy features. But actually, a lot of what you're seeing here, these are not ornamental features. Obviously, this is a replica and it is ornamental. But the real sword that it's based on, which is actually very similar in a lot of ways, has practical features which were there for a good purpose. And I'll make sure to go over them step by step.
But first, before we go over the practical features of those military sabres, let's have a look at these two examples here. Haha! I tricked you! The one on the left is actually a French 1822 light cavalry sabre, and you couldn't tell the difference. I think someone's been copying homework again.
First up, the scabbard. Now I'll probably mention about the possibilities, though I will mention explicitly right now that this following little digression probably would not have been happening very often, if at all. But as an advantage of something you can do with a steel scabbard is you can use it as an extra item. So in a combat scenario, I can ward blows with this, and I can perform what is called a single-time defence. Now, those of you who don't do sword fighting or other weapon-based combat, single-time defence is where instead of this kind of video game style, I block the attack, and then I attack, I defend, and then I attack, which is a very clunky idea of how to perform combat. It is normally necessary if you have a single object, such as a single spear or sword, although actually as you get advanced you can learn a single-time defence, like taking your opponent's sword offside while performing an action like a thrust or a cut. It's generally easier to do a single-time defence, blocking while attacking when you've got a second object, such as a shield, a lantern, a scabbard, a pistol, something like that. There are various systems, including complex parrying daggers specifically made for the purpose. But it's quite useful, and it's also quite durable, and that is my next point on why, actually, there was a purpose to having a steel scabbard. So, when I've got something like this steel scabbard, when you look at historical arms and armour, and even general items, a good reason why you can have a steel scabbard as an advantage is that they're just really durable. Now, yes, when you look at these sorts of objects from history, and the fact that the historical scabbards of leather and wood in various combinations, they tend to be destroyed. Yes, you can argue there is a realistic degree of they are organic materials, they rot, they decay. But it is noteworthy that when you look at things like, let's say, sword grips and other bits and pieces that are made from these natural materials, including leather and wood, they do survive with a reasonable frequency, or at least they are in less destroyed conditions, sort of poor, worn conditions where you can get a sort of facsimile of what it used to look like, whereas the scabbards tend to be lost or utterly destroyed. And it's noteworthy that, yes, you can find a few of these sorts of steel scabbard items missing or having damaged scabbards, but far less frequently. And not just because of the natural organic decay, because bearing in mind steel can rust and corrode away as well in years. The key thing that makes these scabbards really useful in long-term campaigns, and bearing in mind how abusive militaries can be, I will admit, I've never actually had full military experience. I only spent a year with the Royal Marine Voluntary Cadet Corps when I was a child, but I know that from other people who've done full service in military, people tend to really heavily abuse their equipment to almost impressive degrees. So when you've got something even like a sword scabbard, and bearing in mind the momentum of cavalry, you know, you're not just walking around with your weapon, you're carrying it on horseback, and it's clattering and battering about, and sometimes it's going under duress, and maybe a sword stroke will come at it, or it'll be shot out, or various things will be happening to this thing on campaign in ways which you'd think will unlikely, but yet somehow magically happen more frequently than they ought to. Steel scabbard's really good because it's durable and it's built to last. It's one of those things where it's a lot more idiot-proof, which is just the way you want military equipment to be. When you've got these types of scabbards, they don't deform as easily, so let me take this out. I could try to bend this and it won't, not unless I'm really deliberately trying to do so. I could even, as I mentioned, use it as an extra object. I could hit someone or something with it and it wouldn't really get damaged so easily. And just in general, it can go through a lot of sheathing and drawing of the weapon without getting worn down so much. Whereas things like leather and wood sort of scabbards and sheaths, typically, especially when people are, you know, acting under duress, they tend to draw and sheath in ways where it wears out the material and tends to cut through, and sometimes even into the fingers. Whereas these are built to last. But that does come with a downside. It is important to note that when you have these steel scabbards, yes, there is the obvious factor of they add some weight, but another important detail is that when you're drawing and sheathing a sharp weapon on a metal scabbard, not a leather or wood one, it is wearing the edge down, which means that you will have to maintain the blade more frequently, and you may even find that when it comes to battle you've worn the blade down faster than you realised it should have, which is quite a problem and means that the blade would need more maintenance, and also the fact that the blade will need to be sharpened more frequently, and find that it actually needs to be sharpened when you didn't realise you needed to, when you find your blade is a bit dull in the middle of battle. Another brief point and a little side note about these steel scabbards is you might have heard in the sort of Hollywood context, you've got that classic shing noise as opposed to a dull sort of unenthusiastic noise. And that's because there were historical examples in early cinema, which are of course more recent history, and it meant that there were a lot of people with antiques who realised, oh, it makes that noise. Oh, that's quite exciting, and then, oh, we can include that in television. One of those things where it's a representative noise, even though actually that ching type of noise specifically comes from metal scabbards. Now, ignoring scabbards for a minute, another key point of the weapon is the guard. Now you'll notice this, and this is just like the real life version, even though this is a replica, you have a 3-bar hilt. Now, you have different grades of hilts. Sometimes I've seen things like the so-called cabbage chopper sort of artillery sword, which looks like almost an impersonation of a gladius in a cartoonish way, which would just have a little crossguard, extremely rare to find in things like the Napoleonic era and later towards things like the American Civil War. But there's still one or two examples around. Then you have hilts which are more like a sort of, I think they call them stirrup hilt. So you've got things which would be just, imagine this single bar, and you'll find them sometimes on certain spadroons, on certain designs of things like small sword, which were used for things like gentlemanly duelling, and also a couple of other examples of swords, but less frequently. And then you have examples like this, which start to come out further, and then you get ones which come out more like a whole 90-degree protection, especially when you start getting over to the likes of cutlasses. And then the most extreme version would be a full basket hilt, like you'd see on a Highland regiment sword. Now, these have their different advantages and disadvantages. Now, when you've got a larger hilt, it does bring the balance backwards and add weight to the sword, which does make them a bit heavier, but you've got a more full protection for the hand. Now, a key thing to note is that typically the more you're looking at cavalry swords, the more they lend to smaller, sort of like these types of hilts. The more they are infantry swords, the more they tend to have greater hand protection. And also it tends to correlate with shorter blades. Excuse me, that you'd have larger hilts. Now this, obviously there will be plenty of exceptions, that's a broad rule, and it's not, you'll find plenty of outliers to that general idea. But the reason being is that when I am, and you might have noticed I'm doing a bit of this, a bit of dexterity, which is firstly a habit of mine, you can almost ignore it in those cases, but it's also a practical application in terms of using your sword. So, when I have something like a full basket-hilted sword, yes, there's that great degree of hand protection, and you can deliberately exploit it. It's not just, oh, you know, my hand is safe when with the occasional hit. You can deliberately exploit it by presenting the hand and using it as a form of defence. So you're no longer thinking about warding with just the blade. This is why when you look at things like medieval swords, people tended to start with the blade backwards. So you're starting an area where if you had your hands presented forward too much, you're going to get wounding actions to your hands and arms, which is quite dangerous. With these sorts of military sabres, there is a greater sort of inclination to present the sword forward. And indeed, when you're looking at things like these sorts of military sabre, different treatises, I'm used to British military sabre, but pretty much all of these types of military sabre tend to have that sword presented forwards. In sources that are contemporary, you know, that are from the same time period as these, where they don't do that and the swords are more retracted, tend to be with weapons that have still got that medieval style grip, like the Indian tulwar and other such blades. So with these types of Western style weapons, that guard allows you to present the sword forward without having as much risk to the hands. But I've mentioned there's less protection on these types of guards, and that's because you've got a greater degree of flexibility. Cavalry are cutting at many times, sometimes across against people, from horseback against other people on horseback. They might be cutting downwards at various angles, sometimes more diagonally of course, or perhaps more directly downwards, depending on how they're crossing by, what they're attacking, what they're defending, and how they're presenting the blade. And there was even an exercise called something like tent pegging from the... Although that's a British exercise, it's noteworthy that one of the things that is a problem is you can be starting to thrust or cut, well, usually thrust with that type of exercise, and then as you retract the blade, you want to retract it even, into this which is called a hanging guard, so that if someone has just been stabbed and they want a vengeance hit against the passing cavalry, you can then go into a hanging guard, parry it, and then recover. So it's basically a thrust, exit, recover, or it can be cut, exit, recover. You know, you can even go from left, right, exit, recover, and that can turn into a whirling motion. Or you can do it in a cut, stop, depending different ways. But with these types of hilts, you've got greater degree of flexibility. I've got less in my way, and it allows me to actually have a better defense and a better attack because I've got more flexibility and maneuverability of the weapon. It's very important when you are cavalry, and even more so when you are light cavalry, because you are not relying on things like armour or heavy weapons, or you're not things like dragoons, so you're more using firearms. You're looking at people who are using the swords quite frequently, and then you're using the swords flexibly, because that will actually provide you with the best defence, as well as a good opportunity to attack in a variety of angles and in a variety of situations. Now, on the subject of different opportunities for attack, this replica is straight bladed. The original was distinctly curved bladed. Now, this is for an important reason. The more you have a straight blade, now personally I prefer straight bladed swords when fighting, and that is because when you have a straighter blade, as you can see, if I've got a straight line from where my hand is to where the target is, this is quite useful. It's useful for creating direct line attacks. It means that when I cut, the area that my cut is reaching is pretty much where I'm pointing at any time. I find that quite useful for controlling the cut. It's much easier because you're not following with the blade. If you have a curved blade, the more it curves backwards, the later you hit. So by the time I've hit here, which as you can see my pointer's towards you at the camera, I would have to actually, with a more extremely curved blade, I'd have to come further down to about here before the curved tip has actually reached its target. So I prefer straight-bladed swords, but that is from an infantry perspective. That is from a person who's fighting on foot. Now, there were plenty of people who used curved swords on foot, but I find that I prefer it that way. Now, an advantage with curved swords is that they lend themselves, the more they are curved, the more they lend themselves not to a chopping cut, which is a thing that I like with the straight-bladed swords. They land at the target and chop through them. You are performing more of a draw cut. So this is more of a slicing action. Think like you are using a kitchen knife to cut a piece of meat, or you're slicing through vegetables. You'll find if you just push down on the blade, you are not cutting very efficiently, whereas if you draw along and perform a slicing action, that provides the most efficient cut, minimum effort for maximum cutting. This is also very useful for your recovery, because getting stuck can be an interesting thing in foot combat. So let's say I am attacking someone with a cut one, which is just like a monkey brain. I'm going to cut from my right, because I'm right-handed, downwards in a diagonal chop. This is efficient, it's a good chopping motion. Let's say I've cut at my target, and let's say they're going to come up at me. I can easily, from there, turn in the wound towards something like an inside guard. So you'll notice here, if you were cutting from your right, I've turned the blade, I've performed my cut one, I've chopped into you, turn the blade in, and I've got a bit of an inside guard, which then means that the blade comes in, it meets, and I have parried before I retract and recover in guard. That is foot soldier thinking. That is infantry thinking. As cavalry, you do not want to get stuck in your target. This is why a curved blade for cutting is extremely useful. Because as you are performing that slicing action, instead of your blade catching in and getting caught, you're instead slicing through, and you're cutting. It's like in TV, like when you're looking at really those sort of really gory kind of TV versions of fantasy violence. You're not chopping and getting stuck at a target, you're cutting through the target. Although in television that tends to be represented like everyone's made of plasticine, whereas in real life, of course, there is a degree of getting stuck, and with a curved blade you're simply slicing along and coming out by natural means. You do not have to cut deeply or entirely through the thing you're cutting. You simply have cut at the target, and the natural motion draws along, slices continuously, so you're still inflicting wounds. You have cut, it's performed a draw cut, and then you are still moving, so you can do a cut and recover, cut and cut. So if I was cutting through a line, let's say I had approached some artillery, I had approached from their left flank, from their right flank I'd probably prefer, and then that means I can cut right-handed as a right-handed user. I have then cut along. So let's say there was a battery of 3 or 4 cannon or other artillery pieces. I can cut, recover, cut, recover, cut, recover, cut, recover. Whereas with a straight blade, I might be more inclined. I cut, I'm getting stuck, I'm having to kind of extract. If the blade doesn't get yanked out of my hand, it might be more like an awkward recovery, and then I might have lost an opportunity, and then I've only cut 2 people instead of having 4 opportunities to attack. Of course, in real life, people are moving, people are manoeuvring, because interestingly enough, they don't want to die. So it causes an interesting situation where I want to keep cutting and keep attacking, because I might find I've only cut on 4 different opportunities to attack the artillerymen. I've managed to land a wound on 1 of them because they kept moving and dodging out of the way. Another interesting point, play on words, is, I mean, this is a terrible representation. This is more like a spear tip on this replica sword. The real one was more like a sort of single-edged type of tip. It kind of curled back. I mentioned it was a curved sword, excuse me, and it would have a bit more of a backwards tip, but it meant that you had the curvature still coming through to the tip, which allows the cutting to continue all the way through. But it also means that with that final point, it's not like the British 1796 light cavalry sabre, so that's an equivalent light cavalry sabre, even though they're quite different in time, 1796 versus 1860. It's interesting to note that those designs, with more of a hatchet tip, they've got more forward weight because they've got more of a, I wouldn't say a blunt tip, but the hatchet tip is broader and it involves more cutting action all the way through, and with that weight towards the tip, you'll find it slings itself more, kind of like how an axe tends to have more of a chopping and cutting motion than a sword for the same weight, because of its more forward weight. With the 1860, it seems that it's got a finer point, even finer than this poor replica, and it involves more thrusting, so that makes it a quite, what's the word, flexible design, so you can use it for cutting or thrusting. It's got a broad enough blade and enough weight that it can do plenty of cutting, but it's got a fine enough point that you can also do a thrust and retract, like I mentioned earlier, as well. So it allows you to have plenty of options whether you're fighting people who are foot soldiers, whether you're fighting people who are other cavalry, whether you've ended up being dismounted from your horse and have to fight with the weapon on foot yourself. You've got plenty of options available. Another thing to mention is this replica has kind of gotten some of the idea of what it's supposed to do with fullering, although it kind of stops a bit prematurely. Fullering allows for a sword which is fairly light comparatively, but yet quite broad. This makes it a good cutting blade without becoming overweight. Now, the real sword actually weighed about 2.5 pounds or somewhere in that region. I'll put the stats on screen here. But the design is made so that basically it's got a good bit of heft, but it's not overweight because it's meant to be able to continue moving. Like I said, you need to attack and recover, so you can continue fighting quite dynamically. This isn't a one chop, I cut someone's head clean off with a massive sword and then I'm going to applaud myself while several hundred soldiers are still remaining. I've got work to do. So having a broad-bladed, well, it's not massively broad-bladed, but reasonably broad-bladed, fullered blade makes it nice. Now, it's interesting to note as well that it's a 35-inch blade. This example that I'm holding in my hands is a 33-inch blade, so again is not like the real-life version, but you can get an idea that it's a long-bladed sword. Having any blade over about 30 inches long, it can make it a bit less manoeuvrable, but it's great for cavalry reach, it's good for cutting potential, and of course it means that if you're doing things like thrusting, you can extend it out more like a rapier and start your thrust. So you've got those advantages, and typically, again, you will find some exceptions to the rule, but cavalry sabres tend to be longer than infantry sabres. Infantry sabres tend to be in the late 20s of inches, like about 28, 27 inches, kind of like a medieval arming sword tends to be, whereas a cavalry sabre tends to be upwards of 30 inches, like about 32 inches, 35 inches. It's extremely rare to find something more than about 35 inches long, so it's on the longest side of what I normally see in cavalry sabres. The sort of, when you start getting a sword blade of about 40 plus inches long, that's where you start looking at something like a medieval longsword, which is a two-handed blade. I'm sure you could probably find a cavalry sabre that does that, but you would find that it starts to lose its manoeuvrability and starts to become more cumbersome as a result. So it's a good mixture of reach, but yet can still be having good handling, and keeping the weight down to about 2.5 pounds, not including a scabbard, is actually quite a good feat of design. And I do believe that's because it tends to have distal taper. So it starts thicker towards the hilt, and then it starts to thin out towards the tip of the blade. This makes the weight come back a bit, but it tends to feel lighter and also keeps the overall weight down as well. So overall, I think that it's a good design of sabre. Personally, I'm not a massive fan of steel scabbards because they tend to blunt your swords and add a fair amount of weight. I think it's over 3 pounds in weight when you actually add the scabbard to this type of sword. And also, I tend to like, well, I'm coming from more of an infantry perspective, I do tend to prefer the blades that are straighter, and I tend to prefer broader hilts, but again, these designs make a lot of sense for their intended purpose, which is not for foot combat, it is for cavalry combat. And as like cavalry, they want to be manoeuvrable, they want to have that good reach, they've got cutting power, they've got thrusting power, they've got durable scabbards for riding around on horses all day long. You've got plenty of utility in this, even though we are looking in the sort of mid to late 1800s, when of course firearms are dominating the battlefield more and more. Though it should be noted that military sabres were used in active combat even into the 20th century, even though admittedly it gets a lot rarer at that point. So yes, nice sword design overall, even though this replica's not so nice, but I quite like the design and I can understand its purposes for the time period that it's looking at. I hope they found that interesting. I haven't gone much into the history of the regiments and such things because I believe there are American Civil War historians and people who'd know more than me and who would be able to go into detail better in those angles instead. But I hope you found this interesting and quite informative nonetheless. See you for now.